Hello, this is Ed Trickett speaking from my house in Miami, Florida. Thank you for being part of this. I hope you're enjoying the conference. What I'd like to do today is talk to you about structural ways that the United States has attempted to educate adolescent immigrant and refugee kids in the public school context. And I want to start by talking about sort of how big this issue is in the United States, talk about it some from the adolescent point of view, some from the school point of view, and then describe a particular research project I did with a number of graduate students trying to understand the challenges facing teachers and the work lives facing teachers of these particular children. Let me start with the scope of the issue here, and you can see by the screen that the number and diversity of immigrant and refugee adolescents or students actually in the US is quite enormous. 5 years ago in 2015, almost 1 in 4 students in the public schools were the children of immigrant parents. And that number has been rising rather than falling since then. They come from many, many different countries: Mexico, the African countries, Central and South America, Eastern Europe, and particularly in Miami, a lot from Cuba. A large number, 25 to 33%, are in the country in the United States illegally, which poses other additional problems around the educational challenges. Almost 1 in 4 speak languages other than English at home. And there are a large group of unaccompanied minors, that is children who are 8, 9, 10, 15, 16 years old, who come to the country on their own, sometimes sent by families, sometimes not. The important issue here is that there's a tremendous both amount and diversity in the immigrant students in the public schools in the United States. Why come? Why are there so many students here? There are a wide variety of reasons, a diversity of reasons. Some come because of political upheaval, war in their countries. Some come to protect specific family members, such as children who might be the objects of gang violence. Some come to escape persecution because of race or religion. Some come to improve their economic circumstances. Some come to reunify with family members. And parents come to sacrifice their lives so that their children can have what people in the United States ethnocentrically call the American dream. So there's not only a diversity of students, but a diversity of reasons why families immigrate. Now, why focus on adolescents? Well, adolescents coming to the country as an adolescent presents different challenges than coming to the country at an earlier time or being born in the country of immigrant parents. Adolescents in the United States who are immigrants and refugees, they tend to be older entering the country, and they have less time to learn the language and culture. So they have more to catch up on in some ways. Further, they have parents who are more likely first generation with less social capital and greater acculturation tasks to deal with. So the whole family, if you're coming as an adolescent, the whole family has, with some family members, it doesn't need to be parents, although often it is. But it's a collective big task to come to a new country at that particular age. And there's specific adolescent challenges. Here's just a list of them. Learning the language, of course, learning the culture, learning how to do school. The schools in different places in the world don't follow the same kinds of patterns that schools in the United States necessarily follow. They may have different understandings about how parents should be involved with their children's education. So learning how schools function in the United States is a specific challenge. There's a need to develop new social networks. And I have the negotiating cultures here. Being an adolescent, learning to be an adolescent in the United States involves dealing not only with issues of culture and language, but with what I have here is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, different kinds of adolescent seductions and temptations that require particular negotiation when you come into the country as an adolescent. And also there are challenges around family dynamics. Children, we use the word tide mover to describe children and sometimes spouses of people who want to immigrate. And that these children didn't decide to immigrate, it was somebody in their family who did usually. And there's often a sense of loss that they have to deal with. Children learn the culture quickly than their parents generally, and are thrust in culture broker roles, particularly in adolescence, paying bills, helping read papers that come home from school. Often adolescents have to support the family economically, so they have to go to work as well as go to school. So overall, there are just a whole lot of adolescent challenges to be dealt with when you enter the country as an immigrant or refugee adolescent. And there are many more than this really, but there are 4 general structural school responses. Like, how do schools deal with kids coming in as immigrants and refugees? The first one I mentioned is just what I call sink or swim. And that basically is throwing students into the mainstream classrooms, making no specific structural accommodations for them, having them learn how to cope with being in a new country by throwing them into the ongoing flow of school life. There are often teachers who will be particularly helpful to them or whatever, but there's no structural accommodation for them in the school system. And that's one way that immigrant adolescents have to cope. A second, and the one that's the main concern in this particular presentation, involve what's called ESL or ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Languages. And this is these are schools that take out an extended period of class during several days a week, maybe 5 days a week, but not always 5 days a week, with extensive preparation only of immigrant and refugee students for learning English and for some acculturation-related learning. So this particular response sets aside a particular time in the school day where immigrants and refugees go together to a particular class for, among other things, intensive English instruction. The next kind of response is more holistic. It's called newcomer centers. And these are schools within a school. That is not just 1 or 2 periods a day, but for most of the day, or almost all the day usually, students, refugee and immigrant students, are in their own sets of classes where they learn not only English, but science, social studies, history, various kinds of school subject matter. They also tend to have more extended services, programs for parents, for example, sometimes social services for students, particularly those who come from traumatic backgrounds. So that's a more holistic approach. And then there are a few freestanding high schools in the United States with immigrants only. So they have their own school where for a couple years, they will take classes, do athletics, eat lunch, engage in extracurricular activities, having their own school. So these structural responses differ in terms of intensity of time spent developing distinct experiences for immigrant and refugee adolescents. And the most prevalent is the ESOL structure, or English for Speakers of Other Languages, with extended class time. And that's the object of the research project that I want to describe to you now. For many years, I've spent time working with public schools to try to understand the demands on adolescent, immigrant, and refugee kids in the schools and the challenges faced by the schools in trying to educate this particular group of kids. And what I'm going to describe for you now is an interview study done in Chicago, Illinois, with 16 ESL high school teachers across a wide range of urban high schools, and within the structure of the ESL program, or the extended class time, where they would teach a particular group of immigrant and refugee kids throughout the school year in a group of their own. These teachers were mostly born in the United States, but also came from other countries, such as Ukraine, Mexico, and Greece. Many of them had non-traditional career paths. That is, they didn't start out wanting to be a teacher and then sort of switch over to ESL. They often came into ESL particularly as a result of other experiences they'd had in life. Many had taught, all had taught or traveled abroad extensively. Most spoke at least 2 languages and some 3 or 4. So these ESL teachers, the ones were self-selected in a different manner than the regular teachers, mainstream teachers in the school. And I and some graduate students interviewed 16 of them. We developed the interview in collaboration with ESL teachers, working, as I like to do, with people who actually live the life I want to understand through my research. These interviews all started with what I call a grand tour question. What's it like, and a very open-ended question. What's it like to teach at your school? And then we probe specific areas such as job characteristics, stressors, or what we call uplifts, which are things that rewards really of the teaching profession, relationships with other teachers, and relationships with other parents. So the idea was to try to understand what it's like to be an ESL teacher, what the stresses are, what the challenges are, and what they do about it. We went through a coding process of the interview data that I'll spare you, but if any of you are interested and want to be in touch with me about specifics on this particular project, I can include some information about the coding. Basically, what we did was to organize the interviews in terms of domains of experience of the classroom ESL teachers, ESOL teachers, that captured what we think was a complex, multifaceted, and improvisational role. The paper that we wrote about it summarized the findings in a sentence, and that's at the top. The kids are terrific. It's the job that's impossible. Now, we organized the results in 4 domains of experience: classroom-related, school-relaid, a role expansion, the teacher role expansion with respect to students, over and above what many mainstream teachers reported their experience being, and a role expansion with respect to getting to know and be useful to parents of these particular kids. With respect to the school and classroom-related factors, one of the primary things these teachers reported was a sense of feeling marginal in the broader school culture. That is, they felt they were singled out, much in the way that in some schools in the United States, special education teachers are singled out, to not be to be doing something kind of different than most of the teachers in the school, being left out of decisions involving school policy sometime, not having access to resources, often being placed in classrooms that were in the hither parts of the school. So feeling marginal was a big finding with respect to the school-related stressors or job-related characteristics. They also reported that they got to know the students, the immigrant and refugee students, really well in their classes, but they were not used by other teachers as a resource to help other teachers teach these immigrant students in class. They would know about the students' lives, et cetera, but they felt that they could be very helpful to other teachers, but other teachers weren't taking advantage of that. And they also, and this is maybe part of the marginality, felt a lack of administrative follow-up or active support on the part of administrators. With respect to classroom-related job characteristics, basically, the diversity of students they had to teach was a big, big concern. Because in any particular class, they may have students who spoke 5, 6, 7, 8 different languages at home, none of whom spoke English. They came from different cultural backgrounds. Some would have gone through traumatic experiences before immigrating. Some would have not. Some would have had interrupted prior education because of poverty and not being able to afford going to school in their country of origin, or because of political violence or war. And during the year, there'd be considerable turnover of the students coming into the class in the middle of the year, students leaving as families relocated throughout the year, because the immigrant and refugee communities were not stable communities to the same extent that the native-born communities were in these particular schools. So the diversity of students and dealing with that was a big challenge. What we call soft technology was a big challenge, in that many mainstream classes in the US have textbooks, they have sort of ways of presenting curriculum, they have structured lectures, they have slides for things, and there was not such a structured curriculum for this wide array diversity of students, so that ESOL teachers had to make up a lot of exercises, had to do a lot of creating their own particular ways of teaching, their own particular content. Soft technology as opposed to the hard technology of materials that have been prepared beforehand that you can draw on. Also, they reported that a lot of students in their classes were often misplaced because people who are doing the placement of students in classes would mistake special education issues for language issues. So that sometimes students would be seen as having a learning disability by people who placed them, but they had no learning disability, they just couldn't understand the language. So there was a lot of misplacement of students that also related to having to deal with classroom management, classroom presentations, and so forth. And with respect to teacher role expansion, these teachers became very close in many ways to the students they taught because they were with them for an extended period of time. They had all had prior experience in other countries, were interested in different cultures and languages. And they would serve as a resource to other teachers and administrators, sort of as an advocate for students, immigrant and refugee students in the broader school culture. Try to explain to mainstream teachers what a student was going through or why a student did a particular thing in another class that teacher didn't understand. They found themselves in their own classes creating conversations about acculturative topics beyond substantive academic and educational topics. The two that came up relatively frequently were gender relations, sort of how boys and girls in different countries treated each other, and hygiene, what kind of deodorants to wear or not wear, how often people bathe, those kinds of things. These teachers would find themselves often paying for student supplies and lunches. The immigrant and refugee kids were generally not rich, and these teachers took money out of their own pocket to pay for kids. And sometimes they helped kids in their classes in the culture broker role that they needed to play in their families. For example, one teacher talked about how she taught a student to pay family bills that the family couldn't pay because of lack of cultural knowledge in English. So the teachers had a big expanded role with respect to students. And they had a big expanded role with respect to parents. They would serve as kind of networks for connecting parents to social services or legal services that parents otherwise would not know how to access. And sometimes they got to know too much. The kids would somehow confide in them in class about things that happened at home that sometimes put teachers on the spot about whether or not to report something to the authorities, whether or not to recommend going to some kind of social service. But it put them in an uncomfortable position because the teacher role generally in the United States does not very often place teachers in the role of knowing material about, sometimes confidential material about parents' lives that they don't know what to do with, they don't know how to cope with. So in all these ways, the teacher role in the school was one that was seen as marginal, very complicated, and required them to have a somewhat different role than the mainstream teachers. One teacher said that it's an entirely different thing being an ESOL teacher than a mainstream teacher. That may be extreme, but it's extreme in an important direction. Now also, in addition to all these hassles and struggles and stressors, there's a reason they came to school every day, and the kids are terrific. It was the primary reason. They loved seeing students change as they learned the language and learned the culture over a course of a year. And they could often see incredibly large amounts of progress in kids. It was very, very satisfying. They loved being able to create a safe space for these immigrant and refugee kids who in the regular mainstream school were often experienced that as marginal to them. They were sometimes bullied, they weren't understood, they didn't know what was going on, but the ESOL classroom represented a safe space, and teachers understood and appreciated that importance. They got to know students and parents as people. They cherished the idea of getting to know kids in a much broader way than teaching them physics or teaching them English. And they got a consistent sense of support from other ESOL teachers in the school. So there were a lot of things, mostly involving parents, teachers, kids, and teachers in the same structure, that made life really worthwhile for them, and that said basically kept them going. So what I was trying to do today was talk about the life of a teacher, the stressors, the positive things, the negative things, and how a particular structure in the United States of an ESOL class represents a different role for the teachers than a mainstream class, and represents a different opportunity for students to bond both with other students and to have some kind of small buffer between the sink or swim of throwing them into the classroom and them being overly socially isolated to help them make the transition into American high schools. So why bother to worry about the teacher lives? I'd like to close just with a quote from one of my longtime colleagues and mentors, Seymour Saracen, who wrote many, many books about this culture of school and the role of education and the difficulties of educational reform. And he said, whatever factors, variables, and ambience are conducive for the growth development, and self-regard of a school staff are precisely those that are crucial to obtaining the same consequences for students in a classroom. Basically, the way that thriving teachers make it easier and more likely to have thriving students. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry we can't all be together, but till we can. Thanks. Bye.